Hello and welcome to the online forest summit called BC Forests, the People's Convergence. I'm Jennifer Houghton, one of the co-organizers of the summit and BC Forest March. Today we're here to talk about biomass, and I've got three people that I consider experts in the field who are going to counter some biomass disinformation. And today we've got with us Michelle Connolly, who's with Conservation North up in Prince George. Hey, Michelle.
Hi.
And we've got Tegan Hansen, who's with Stand. Hey, Tegan. Where are you at today, Tegan?
Today I'm on Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish territory in Vancouver, but folks probably know I'm usually or often on Snacht and Silch and Tunaha territory in the Nelson area. So happy to see everyone.
Thanks, Tegan. Welcome. And Mary Booth, where are you calling us from today, Mary?
I'm in Massachusetts.
Beauty. Well, thanks for joining us. Dr. Mary S. Booth is a PhD, and she's founder and director of the Partnership for Policy Integrity, which uses science, legal action, and strategic communications to promote sound energy policy and to help citizens enact science-based policies that protect air, water, ecosystems, and climate. Mary is an ecosystem scientist by training, and she received her doctoral degree in ecology at Utah State University, focusing on biogeochemistry and plant ecophysiology. She currently directs the Partnership for Policy Integrity science and advocacy work on greenhouse gas, air pollutants, and forest impacts of biomass energy. Thank you so much for being with us today, Mary. I'm going to let you launch right into your presentation.
Great, thank you so much. I will start sharing my screen. Great, well, thank you everyone for your interest in this subject, which is enormously controversial. I'm going to talk first about some of the science and realities of biomass energy behind the myths that you may have been hearing about biomass being clean and green and carbon neutral. First, let me give a little bit of climate context. This very hairy looking graph is a bunch of scenarios, modeling scenarios of climate pathways to a livable future, basically. And what this shows is this cluster of blue modeling pathways here is an emissions trajectories where we're not only reducing emissions, but actually taking carbon out of the air with net negative emissions eventually. And this is predicted to be necessary for staying below, 2 degrees and certainly 1.5 degrees, which is the goal of the Paris Agreement. So there's no question, where we are right now is a critical time to not only be reducing emissions, but thinking about ways to take carbon out of the atmosphere. And trees are the best way to do that. And indeed, the Paris Agreement acknowledges the important role of forests. Article 4 calls for net climate neutrality by mid-century, achieving a balance between anthropogenic emissions and removals of greenhouse gas emissions. And anthropogenic just means under human control, but doesn't mean that we're doing it. It means that we're trying to increase uptake through active means. And then forests are acknowledged, one of the few concrete things that appears in the Paris Agreement as an actual action to take is that we need to conserve and enhance forests as reservoirs and sinks for greenhouse gases. So trees are the answer, but the question is, why are then countries increasingly promoting burning wood for renewable energy? And we're seeing this in the form of both wood chips and pellets. And I should have also put just residential logs, logs like you burn in a wood stove or a fireplace, And both power plants and residential heating, countries around the world are promoting burning more wood for energy as a way to mitigate climate change. This is happening largely because of an accounting loophole that treats biomass as having zero emissions, despite the fact that it actually emits more CO2 than burning fossil fuels for energy. So here's just some data showing that wood-fired units for both power plants, electricity power plants, this top graph here, and also residential, for instance, boilers for heating. The red bar is the biomass, and the blue bars are different kinds of fossil fuel technologies. And in each case, burning biomass emits more CO2 than burning fossil fuels. Big part of the reason for that is that wood is about 50% water by weight, and so it's extremely inefficient. You have to boil off the water before you produce useful energy. And so, clearly these results are for burning green wood chips. And this actually is I believe this was a Canadian cartoonist that did this. Cartoonist, fantastic evocation of how inefficient burning biomass is. But even when you're burning dried wood pellets, there's still a big discrepancy, and more greenhouse gases coming out of the smokestack of an electric power plant burning wood pellets than when it's burning coal. And this is a complicated looking slide that just boils down to a few lines at the bottom there. These are actual data from the Drax power station in England, which burns a lot of wood pellets, including some imported from Canada, showing that emissions per megawatt hour are higher for biomass than they are for coal. And also natural gas, I put that as a comparison, that they're predicting that they're going to also be switching to natural gas as well as biomass. So another marvelous Canadian resource actually is a model from Natural Resources Canada, and the address for that is there at the bottom of the page. This is to show that it's not just the CO2 coming out of the smokestack when you burn biomass, but it's a persistent impact because trees take a long time to grow back, whereas burning them emits carbon very quickly. And so that extra CO2 that's been emitted from burning the biomass accumulates in the atmosphere and keeps accumulating. And in contrast to, for instance, burning fossil fuels, where the offsetting effect is non-existent, it's not taken into account here in this model. But nonetheless, even though trees are presumed to be growing back in this model, you can see that the so-called carbon debt persists for a long time. And you can configure the modeling scenarios in this carbon calculator any way you want. You can try out different kinds of fuels, different timeframes, compare it against different kinds of fossil fuels, different technologies. And in most cases, burning wood for energy emits more carbon, obviously at the stack every time, but then persists. That carbon impact persists over decades. In fact, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change does not treat bioenergy as carbon neutral. And the convention has been to count biomass emissions in the so-called land sector. When countries report their greenhouse gas emissions, they report both emissions and uptake in the land sector, such as growth by forests, taking carbon out of the air. And so when forests are cut and burned, that shows up in that accounting as a reduction in the amount of CO2 being taken out of the air by forests. And so it's not counted in the energy sector in order to avoid double counting. But the IPCC is warning here that the convention of treating it as zero in the energy sector shouldn't be interpreted as meaning that it actually has zero emissions. It does still have emissions, they're just not being counted in the energy sector. And in fact, they emphasize that if you're going to actually claim a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, you've got to do that by offsetting those emissions through increased net carbon uptake of biota and soils. Despite these realities, biomass is treated as zero CO2 in the European Union's Renewable Energy Directive and the Emissions Trading Scheme. And this has served as a powerful incentive for the European Union to burn more and more and more biomass, some of which is being imported from North America, including Canada, and counting all of the wood that they're burning, whether it's sourced in the EU or somewhere else, as zero emissions, whether it's burned in a power plant, whether it's burned by a household. And as I said before, carbon loss may be counted if forest carbon uptake decreases, but accounting is generally inadequate. And meanwhile, this treatment of biomass as zero serves as a powerful incentive to burn a lot of biomass. And when I say powerful incentive, I mean to the tune of billions of dollars, or in this case, billions of euro. The EU spent more than 6 billion euro subsidizing biomass in 2017. This is from a very good NRDC report. I highly recommend it. This was just 15 member states, the money that they spent incentivizing biomass in 1 year. Imagine the solar panels or wind turbines that could be built using that money. Now, as I mentioned before, Drax is a power plant that's burning biomass, no longer in the EU because the UK is no longer in the EU, or I should say England is no longer in the EU. But Drax has increased the amount of wood pellets it's burning each year, and it's now burning 7.1 million tons as of 2019, 1.1 million tons of which were from Canada. But it's not just the EU, it's Asia too. And here is some shots from Asia Biomass Conference in 2019, a reception put on by the British Columbia Pellet Association, where they dressed up in red plaid and had, I don't know if you can see the axes in the lower right-hand corner picture there, but they even had little Japanese parasols that were in red plaid. So they are all over the world promoting burning biomass and selling more and more Canadian biomass all over the world. Meanwhile, Canada has committed to meeting that Paris Agreement goal of net zero emissions by 2050, and they've said that they want to do it and that they're going to be planting 2 billion trees to do it and pursuing other nature-based solutions, protecting and conserving Canada's lands. So what might a pathway to net zero emissions in Canada look like? Well, net zero emissions is the product of the emissions plus the negative emissions of forest uptake, or indeed land sector uptake in this case. So this is just starting with 2020 emissions levels, and the land sector in Canada and the forest sector, which is part of the land sector. Those two lines should become more negative over time as more carbon gets taken up, and fossil fuel emissions should be coming down. And then the net emissions, which is the product of those two things, would also trend down towards zero by 2050. That's what one pathway could look like for Canada. But what do Canada's emissions look like now? Well, this is starting in 1990 and ending up in 2020, but what you can see is that emissions are still going up. The forest carbon sink is becoming less, i.e. less negative. So forests are storing less and less carbon. The land carbon sink is becoming less negative, largely because the forest products industry is such a large source of emissions in Canada. And basically, the story is not good because the trend is exactly wrong. There's a big turnaround that has to happen here to get to negative emissions by 2050. And as I mentioned before, the Canadian forest sector is already a big source of emissions. So that's one way that cutting forests is contributing to emissions, as well as just sucking forest carbon out of the forests where it belongs. But also CO2 from biomass is already a large source of emissions in Canada. This isn't counted, but it is reported. Canada reported 72 million tons of biomass emissions in 2018. And then the pellet industry is increasing the amount of CO2 that's being exported out of Canada as pellets overseas. So these are some data from the pellet industry itself. And I should just add some biomass, obviously a lot of biomass is burned in Canada for residential heating and that kind of thing, but also there's a lot of power plants that are burning biomass, and it can be quite expensive. I was pretty shocked to see these two power plants, which only run part-time, and so their cost per megawatt hour is very high. That the Thunder Bay and Atikokan plant, which, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, but both producing power 25 times higher and 8 times higher than average biomass plants in Canada. So just to debunk another myth about the biomass industry, this is really important and really plays into what Michelle and Tegan are going to be telling you in a little while, which is that, there is this claim that the biomass industry in Canada is primarily using sawmill residues as feedstock for pellets. But what we see here is that forest industry and harvesting is about the same now as it was in 1990. So you really wouldn't expect to be seeing a lot more sawmill residues created as feedstock. But meanwhile, pellet exports have increased 580 times since 1990. So clearly they're not using just residues, or they're sucking residues out of other sectors, like, for instance, particle board, which may not be the greatest product in the world, but it does at least represent sequestered carbon that's not in the atmosphere. Whereas burning the biomass, turning it into pellets and burning it, immediately liquidates it to the atmosphere. These are some pictures that I took on a trip to BC, and just pointing out that, yeah, sure, some of the companies are using residues, like in this upper left-hand one, some residues there at the Pinnacle Meadowbrook plant. But then Pacific Bioenergy in Prince George, clearly using whole trees for pellet feedstock. And I just want to say Canada's not alone. This is some pictures from different places. This is Estonia, which has a really big pellet industry that's supplying part of the EU demand. So there's some harvesting for biomass pellets there. Another one from Estonia showing how incredibly damaging the logging is. These are very deep, wet, peaty soils, and they're just ripping everything right out of them, not even leaving anything. No residues left. It's all been taken. Here is North Carolina, following a pellet harvesting for wood pellet manufacturing. Maine, same thing, all gone. All the biomass is gone. And Nova Scotia, again, just vacuuming up every last scrap. I'll just wrap up by saying that there's a lot of international opposition to burning biomass as energy and treating it as zero emissions. And the Environmental Paper Network hosts something called the Forest and Climate Network, has something called the Biomass Delusion Statement, which you can find at this link. And this is the logos of some of the groups that have signed on to that statement. And here's my contact information. I did not have a chance to talk about the lawsuit against the EU that we filed, but the website for the lawsuit is there. We filed to protest their treatment of bioenergy as zero carbon energy. So there's some contact information for you and more information if you're interested. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much, Mary. That was a really excellent presentation, and it was it's good for us to see how what's happening in BC is connected to the larger world. And there are similar things going on in Nova Scotia and in, where was that? Lithuania?
Estonia.
Estonia,
Yeah.
sorry, Estonia.
Yeah, the Baltics are big pellet producing states.
Wow, so we're part of a big movement here. The people in British Columbia who are trying to get changes made here, we're part of a larger movement across the planet for making things happen. So thanks for all that information. We're going to come back to you later with questions. I got some juicy ones for you.
Great.
So we're going to go to Michelle Connolly now. So Michelle, while you're getting your slides set up, I'm going to talk about your background. So Michelle Connolly has a background in disturbance ecology and experience crafting and communicating conservation policy. She's the director of Conservation North, which is a grassroots science-based advocacy group based in Prince George. Thanks so much for joining us today, Michelle. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. So my name is Michelle, and I'm with a grassroots group called Conservation North. We are a volunteer-run, science-based and donation-supported group. I will be talking about what's happening on the ground with regards to forest biomass in our area of focus, which is the northern wet belt in BC's central interior. On this map, everything in yellow has been industrially logged in the past, and what's in green is forest that has never been industrially logged before. So in other words, what's in green is what remains of our primary forest or pre-contact forest in the central interior. In the red oval is our group's area of focus, which is the northern wet belt, and this contains old growth rainforest. So in our backyard, we have two types of rainforest: boreal rainforest, and which is characterized by old, dark spruce and subalpine fir forests. And we have inland rainforest, which has cathedrals of western red cedar and western hemlock, among other species. And these forests are hundreds and sometimes up to thousands of years old. This is one of only 2 inland temperate rainforests in the world. This is what the global distribution of temperate rainforests looks like. And ours is here, and we're focused on the northern tip of this area. Wildlife in this part of BC have evolved over thousands of years to use the variety of natural forest types. Most rely on old forests for some stage of their life cycle. And amazingly, even after 100 years of logging old growth and 60 of that hardcore industrial logging, we still have all our pre-contact large-bodied animals and wildlife. That's not to say that their populations are doing well, just that they're still here. And we consider this to be a privilege, and this is who we're trying to protect with our work here. So this spring, 3 independent scientists released a study on ecological risk to old growth forests in BC. And our region came out as being a giant red zone. So an area of high risk to biodiversity loss because of the loss of old forests. And in particular, the disproportionate loss of old growth forests in areas where you have really big old trees. So much of these forests went into sawmills and pulp mills. Conservation North's position on how we should treat our public forests is based on what we've learned from the scientists' old growth report, what we know about endangered species in our region, and what we know about the degradation of primary forests worldwide, which is that 82% of them have been degraded. That's the latest global number. We believe that industrial forestry should happen in areas already logged in the past. So we want natural forests, forests that have never been industrially logged before, to be left alone. We want them to be protected. There's no such thing as sustainable logging of primary forest anymore. Last year, this photo was taken outside a local pellet plant. It shows whole Western red cedar logs going into the plant. This is from the company's website. As it turns out, they admit that they do use whole logs for pellets. We had heard that harvesting was happening for pellets, but we didn't know exactly where it was happening. A few months ago, one of our steering committee members, Sean O'Rourke, happened upon flagging in an area of inland rainforest he was exploring. So what this means is that the BC government has granted a license to a pellet company to log primary forest for pellets. This is what one of the planned pellet cup blocks look like. The name on the orange flagging indicates the name of the pellet company, and this is old growth forest. This is Sean in a different part of the same planned pellet cup block. He's sitting next to an old growth red cedar. This is another view of a planned pellet cup block in the rainforest. Since we came across these blocks, we've obtained a bit more information about what's going on. The company has an operating area in which they are apparently allowed to harvest old growth rainforest. This spatial data that we use to make this map is publicly available. It's on the BC government website. On this map, past cut blocks as of 2019 are in red. In purple are planned or future cut blocks. And in the circle, there's an outlined yellow area. And this is one of 7 of the pellet company's license areas, the areas that they have the rights to harvest. And the one outlined in yellow here is one planned cut block for this winter. This is a CAN4 cut block adjacent to one of the planned pellet cut blocks. When we started hearing about forest biomass, bioenergy, the messaging coming from the BC government was that only waste, such as this pile, would be used for this industry. To be clear, as a community group, we are opposed to harvesting old growth for any purpose, but we understood bioenergy to be a secondary use of the forest. As Mary mentioned. This is the understanding most of us had. So I think most people would be surprised to discover that old growth rainforest is on the chopping block for the production of energy. In this drone shot is another perspective of a planned pellet cut block in primary or old growth forest. What's on the right side of the road here is slated to be cut for pellets this winter. We took this photo just a few months ago. I would like to talk about Clean BC for a minute. So this is the BC government's plan for addressing climate change. Even though protecting nature, in particular old forests, is a well-established way of protecting the climate, this solution does not make an appearance anywhere in Clean BC. Not only is protecting old growth forests nowhere in this plan, but every manipulation of forests except for their protection is packaged as a way to address climate change in materials coming out of the BC government. So things like planting trees, creating biofuels, which are liquid fuels from forests, and bioenergy are contained here. In June, a webinar was hosted by the Canadian Bioeconomy Conference. You can find the video on YouTube. In the webinar, the Chief Forester of BC explained that she is working closely with the federal government, co-chairing 2 committees of the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers. And those 2 committees are on climate change and bioeconomy. And this is a quote from the Chief Forester from the video. So she says, "There's additional wood out there that we don't currently utilize. That's where the opportunity is for the bioeconomy. The only way to access that wood is through a concerted effort on changing how we harvest and pull it from the woods." BC is helping industry promote and market pellets via the BC Bioenergy Network. which has close ties with the Council of Forest Industries, which is the lobbying organization for all of BC's big logging companies. So we looked up something called the annual allowable cut determination for the Prince George timber supply area, and realized that forests not considered saw log worthy can be considered pellet worthy, or at least that's how it reads in this document, which you can find online. This is an old red cedar with what looks like a bear den in it, in one of the planned pellet cut blocks. If you read some of the press releases coming from the BC government, from the Ministry of Forests, you'll see language about how feedstock for pellet plants is, quote, waste, low value, damaged, or inferior. If the BC government is granting licenses to log old growth forests for biomass, we can only conclude that BC views old growth forests as these things. So this is really, it's really looking like an attempt to rebrand old growth forests as inferior and waste. In combination with rebranding old growth rainforest as low value and waste, they are trying to brand the fuel coming from primary forests as, quote, clean, green, low carbon. Fuel derived from primary forests in any way is in fact not clean or green in any way, shape, or form. And this is unacceptable greenwashing. This is another image within one of the pellet cut blocks. So we know that logging for energy creates a double climate problem because we lose an important carbon sink when primary forest is cut, and carbon pollution is created during the harvesting, manufacturing, shipping, and burning of wood pellets. Protecting ecosystems is an established solution of climate change, so it makes it extra appalling that the BC government and industry is trying to sell the destruction of primary forests as a climate solution. This drone shot was taken from an area adjacent to a planned pellet cut block. And Sean O'Rourke is responsible for all these excellent photos. This is yet another photo of a planned pellet cut block. And this flagging may be for demarcating where they want to put a road. So the threat to BC's last primary forests is intensifying because of forest biomass and biofuels. In brackets, bioenergy is another term. So this was my first slide. It's a photo taken from a drone of an area adjacent to a planned pellet cut block. I used the word vacuum here because pellet plants can vacuum up our remaining primary forests in no time. There is potentially infinite global demand for energy products, and our last old growth forests and communities should not have to pay the price for this. Pellet plants are poised, if we allow them to become a primary forest vacuum in the same way that sawmills and pulp mills did historically here. So BC and industry are currently testing the waters on social license for this. And in the process, they're concealing the reality of what forest biomass is about. So they don't want you to see the photographs that we've just showed you of where exactly these materials are coming from. In the bioeconomy conference video from a few slides back, one of the industry speakers admits that their industry has a PR problem. We concur, and that's because logging old growth has a PR problem. And if anyone from the sector is watching this, step one to dealing with your PR problem is to refuse to log old growth and declare this publicly. We promise that your PR problem will continue if this type of practice continues. What we've learned from the province's old growth strategic review process, which we're waiting for a final report on, is that most BCers want old growth protected. So I would ask anyone viewing this to send this this presentation to everyone you know, and to contact us if you would like to support our efforts to protect old growth forest here. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. The information that you shared, Michelle, is shocking. It's heartbreaking. It's disheartening. It's incredibly disheartening to hear how there's a PR effort aimed at destroying our forests in essence. And I've got some more questions for you, but you know, what I read from some of your slides is what the BC government is saying is that trees can't be used for lumber. The government is now allowing corporations to cut them down for pellets. So the economic value of cutting a forest is no longer dependent on whether it's usable for lumber. And so that opens up pretty much all of the forests in BC to industrial logging. And that's incredibly depressing for me. So we'll come back to this later. Thanks so much, Michelle, for all of your detailed work there. All right, Tegan, let's move on to your show here. I'm going to just read out your bio, and then I'll turn it over to you. So Tegan Hansen works for Stand on their forest team and is based in BC. She brings a strong background in communications and community organizing with a focus on land protection, wildlife, and climate justice. Tegan works with communities online and on the ground to defend forests and challenge corporations to clean up their supply chains. Tegan grew up primarily in Nelson and in the inland rainforest in the BC interior, and those inland rainforests are particularly close to her heart. She calls herself a caribou nerd and can often be found wandering mountain trails with a sketchbook. Welcome, Tegan. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Yes, I'm a caribou nerd and I'm unashamed to say so. I will just share my screen here. So I'm really grateful to be following those two excellent presentations from Mary and Michelle. And likely I'm going to be reiterating a few of those points made, but specifically I want to talk about the wood pellet exports from Canada with a focus on BC. So wood pellets being the manufactured forest-based biomass fuel product that we send abroad from forests here and from our manufacturing plants here in BC. So this begins with a report that Stand released earlier this year in April. We were interested in finding out just what's going on with the pellet sector in BC. We knew from allies and partners elsewhere in the world about how biomass fuel can really impact forests. But like Michelle talked about, a lot of the rhetoric we'd heard in BC was very clearly about sawmill residuals, waste, not about forest harvesting. And we wanted to know whether that was true, whether or not that's problematic in itself, and where our pellet exports are going. Are whole trees being used? What's the threat level here, basically? You can find that report on our website, so stand.earth/publication. You'll find that report there, and feel free to read on through. In looking at what is the big picture here, what are the trends, this is a pretty clear indication of where we're at in Canada. So in a less than a decade period, from Statistics Canada's export data, we see a pretty clear indication of what's going on with this industry. That's a doubling in export volume from 2012 to 2019, measured in metric tons. So that's all of Canada. So unfortunately for us here in BC, that all of Canada data is not proportional to provincial population. It's very much in line with BC leading the charge on forestry issues in other sectors. Here in BC, we account for the vast majority of those exports. So this table on the left shows in the first row our total exports from BC in 2019, And then it's broken down by country in terms of where those are going. So Mary mentioned the UK, England, and Asia. You can see really clearly there, the UK by far and away the primary source for wood pellet exports from BC, and then Japan coming in second. So this quote on the right, I pulled from a lovely letter from the executive director of the Wood Pellet Association of Canada. You'll all remember earlier in the year when the RCMP once again invaded Wet'suwet'en territory, and there were a number of rail blockades in response and in solidarity. The executive director called on federal ministers to remove those blockades. And in doing so, he said, 90% of Canadian production goes to Europe and Asia. British Columbia accounts for about 80% of that. And of that, 50% goes through the port in Prince Rupert. So to give you a sense of why those numbers shape up the way they do, this map from Canadian Biomass magazine, which is an industry magazine, shows you in red where the pellet plants are located in Canada. And you can see very clearly in BC, the industry is really centralizing in the north around Prince George, and then a little bit down through into the Okanagan and along the inland rainforest as well. A number of plants, especially out east, will make a mix of wood pellets for export and for domestic use. In BC, we're very much export focused, which is why some of you might be thinking of that wood pellet shortage in stores for people to use in their homes in this past winter in BC, though those plants aren't making primarily for domestic or even at all. It's all being shipped overseas. So we wanted to look at a couple of plants to get a sense of, by focusing on some specific areas, what the trends might look like on the ground. So these are actually the two plants that both Mary and Michelle have referenced. On the left is Pinnacle's facility. It's between Prince George and Quesnel. And on the right is Pacific Bioenergy's facility in Prince George. This is readily available satellite data. You can find it on Google. Very clearly shows a lot of logs piled at both facilities. We have a lot of photos now to showcase that in fact logging trucks go into these facilities all the time. So this isn't really a surprise, but unfortunately for most people in BC who wouldn't think that trees would be, dried out and made into wood pellets, this is probably a bit of a shock. So let's look at what this means for the land base. And actually we're gonna just go straight to the source. Pinnacle, we'll start there. So this is from this quote on the bottom here and this picture on the left, showing Premier Horgan. This is from a November 2019 press release. A new contract for Pinnacle in Japan that's coming into effect in 2023. Horgan says that he's excited about this partnership using BC wood waste to generate good jobs in BC and power clean, renewable electricity in Japan. At the same time, we are seeing Pinnacle growing as a company. Their profits have been growing this year. And just this year, they've once again adjusted their procurement activities using more harvest residuals and biologs just from Q1, so the first quarter of 2020 to the second, using harvest residuals and biologs has risen by 7%. The term biologs, you'll see a lot if you look at industry rhetoric around biomass. If someone has a definition, I'd love for them to send it to me. From what I can tell, they have just thrown the word bio in front of logs and called it a day. It's lovely greenwashing, but it really aligns with what we've talked about, what Michelle really poignantly talked about calling trees that are not suitable for sawmills, they have apparently no other value other than to be turned into pellets. So this is Pinnacle. We're seeing clear growth. We're seeing increased reliance on harvesting. And in fact, we did find in one of their reports when we looked into the plant in Strathnaver that they're increasingly, or that they've actually renovated to get more grinders so that they can grind more logs, kind of thing, is what we've taken from that information. Okay, let's look at Pacific Bioenergy. Again, easy peasy. Let's just take a company report. So Pacific Bioenergy supply-based report from 2019. I'll read out what I've highlighted here. It just says, the change of raw material supply in 2019 has shifted away from sawmill residuals due to a decrease in availability with an increase in grinding and forest harvesting for biomass logs. Sawmill residuals have decreased to 22%, with grinding waste piles representing 48% and biomass harvesting representing 30% of the raw material input. So what we saw earlier with Premier Horgan saying waste to turn into BC jobs and clean renewable energy is a very shifting field, because we're seeing that, as we all know, with sawmills either closing or curtailing in the interior, there's simply less sawmill waste or residuals, so sawdust and shavings and whatever else you're going to have after you've turned a tree into 2x4s. Suddenly there's less available, but the demand for wood pellets is increasing. There's new contracts being signed with Japan, for instance, that won't even take place for a few more years. So what do the companies do? They turn toward the forest. On the other side with Slash, so a huge kind of PR piece for the BC government has been turning slash piles that would otherwise be burned on the land into wood pellets instead to be burned elsewhere. The issue is that it is very expensive to haul slash off the land. So the BC government, through a Crown agency, has given these companies millions of dollars to, in effect, and messaging to haul that slash off the land. So that's public subsidies. But what we've seen is in calling these logs inferior, we don't actually know what those funds are going toward. Is it going towards harvesting beetle kill? Is all of what's being harvested beetle kill? There's very little regulation from our perspective on what's actually happening on the ground. So this is a really opaque industry. So I'm just showing again this photo from Conservation North that Michelle showed again. I think it's poignant to show with this quote. When the report was released in April, and when Michelle and I both spoke to this reporter from the National Observer, he got this response from the BC government when he asked about logs on site and being used to make pellets as opposed to just sawmill residuals. And the quote that they gave, inferior logs that are not suitable for manufacturing because they are aged or charred from wildfire get directed to other facilities such as pellet mills. In no sane world would you call the old Western red cedars on that truck inferior. And so we really have a responsibility to hold the BC government to account, because as a lot of folks watching this can probably recognize, this is a very familiar exercise for the BC government to brand harmful forest activities as somehow green or sustainable, but in reality what's happening is really destructive. And as Mary has talked about, if we're being realistic about the future of this industry and about what we need to do to counter climate change, this is not a long-term solution. This is, once again, millions of public dollars going into an industry that will not survive if we adequately address climate change. And if we protect forests, then this industry has to find a new supply base. So those are questions I have for everyone here. A few steps that we're recommending just for the immediate future is that we cannot allow new wood pellet export plants specifically to be built or expanded. That map that I showed earlier of pellet plants in BC, it's possible that it's going to change really rapidly. There's talk of a pellet plant going in on Vancouver Island even. So folks need to be really aware of what's happening. We want those subsidies to the export industry to end, and we echo the calls to protect primary and old growth forests. So that's all I'll say for now. I think I'll hand it back to you, Jennifer, and we'll go from there.
Thank you for that presentation, Tegan. It was really excellent. You shared a lot of information that I think most BC residents aren't aware of. And I sit here right now seething with anger, and I think a lot of people are gonna feel that way as well. It's actually hard for me to control myself, but with all of the anger that I felt, discovering what's happening in our forests in BC over the past couple of years, what I've realized that I have to do is channel that energy into organizing and strategic action. And I think this is going to help a lot of people see that we also need to be very organized and strategic around this biomass push that's being done by our government. Our government is supposed to be representing the public. It's supposed to be representing the best interests of the people in BC, and this is clearly not. So I'm going to ask you just one question to clarify from your presentation, Tegan. So both of those facilities that you showed us those overhead pictures of, are they only producing pellets and not producing any kind of lumber?
That's right. They're only producing pellets.
So every single tree that goes in there is being ground up and shipped, and 80% of it or so, like the government says, is being shipped off for pellets.
As far as we can tell, it doesn't seem like they store those logs for anyone else to use, although I suppose that's a possibility. But that facility, especially in Strathnaver, is very much the only facility in the area alongside the highway.
Okay.
Michelle?
And so, Mary, the four of us went through this sort of presentation as a summary about a week ago, and we were all expressing shock and anger. And so when you see this information specifically about BC, you're looking at it from afar, and biomass is something that you've investigated for quite a while in depth. When you see what's happening in BC, what is your reaction to it?
I'm shocked and horrified just as you are, and having visited those forests, it's even more painful to see what's going on. I hope that this information will open the eyes of some policymakers. The European Union is about to embark on a new kind of a revision of the Renewable Energy Directive. Potentially, they may be reconsidering the role of bioenergy. There's been a lot of denialism by policymakers saying, oh no, trees are never cut for bioenergy, and it's all waste, it's all residuals. It's an inevitable consequence of subsidizing something to the tune of billions of dollars or euros, that demand will grow, and it will outrun so-called sustainable supplies. And frankly, I don't think even sawmill residues are a sustainable supply, because that material could be turned into something like particle board that would represent stored carbon and do a better job mitigating climate change than just immediately sending it into the atmosphere. So, my reaction to this is that I hope that this serves as a wake-up call, and let them who have ears hear.
So, do you guys have any additional comments that you'd like to add, or questions that you'd like to put to each other after those? Just whatever you'd like to add, just dive right in.
Yeah, I'll go. I just want to add that there's little to no social license to log old growth for higher quality or pricier products to begin with. So there is definitely zero social license to be grinding old growth forests into pellets. And I think that the people in power know full well that that's the case. So they're probably trying their utmost to conceal the fact that this is the quote feedstock of these facilities is actual primary and old growth forest. And I would like to add also that on the climate change angle, the BC government and industry are very kind of closely tied on this, because they have, so in February they struck what they refer to as a Climate Solutions Council to provide guidance on climate policy. And if you go to the website on the BC government and look them up, one of the council members is actually the vice president of the Council of Forest Industries, which is the lobby group that represents all the big logging companies in BC. And if you read his bio, his background is in bioenergy. So they have invited somebody with a vested interest in basically harming the climate to participate in this high-level advisory council. And I'm sure they know exactly what they're doing. All these initiatives are really not about addressing climate change. They're not about doing right by the climate or by forests. They're about basically kind of like reviving what's now a dying industry here, because we've had 100 years of logging the highest quality old growth, so the biggest trees, for sawmills and for the pulp mills. And now they're trying to extract from our last old growth forests more money and more profits for corporations. And so that's what this is all about. And people here won't stand for it. And really the only barrier to doing something about this is to raise the alarm bell and show people where they're logging for this.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%, Michelle. And also, I was thinking about what you were both saying, and Mary, to your point about, you know, there's things that we could be doing with sawmill residuals. I think that really underscores the big problem here, is that this industry is just underlining everything, the wood pellet export industry and biomass, it's underlining everything that's already wrong in BC. There's a real lack of creativity and interest in long-term solutions. And it's heartbreaking for the forests and the people who need them, which is all of us. And it's also really devastating to think about the impacts on workers and their families, because this is not a solution for them. But this is where our province is putting millions of dollars. And so I think about that, like just the absurdity of it. And it's so infuriating that this theater of the absurd is where we have to put our time to do battle. So I really think this underscores what a lot of other folks in this forum are going to be saying about needing to change how we do forestry in BC. And certainly that means, yeah, not at all harvesting old growth that's incredibly endangered now in the province. And just rethinking how we mill, who benefits, who's in charge, who makes decisions. All of these points, I think, are really at play and exhibited to their worst when we look at wood pellet exports in BC.
Absolutely, Tegan. We all need to start speaking up, like Michelle is saying, and we also need to start working together, because this is not beneficial for workers. It's not beneficial for people's children and grandchildren. This is another short-term cash grab. BC forests are already so at risk. Why are we cutting them down and just creating more? We're going to be creating more job loss. So all of these billions of dollars in subsidies that are going into corporate profit-making efforts could be going towards creating actual long-term jobs in our communities. That's what we need the BC government to subsidize, is long-term job programs that work with forests for the long term. So Mary, can I ask you, there was something that I think it was in Tegan or Michelle's presentation, how low carbon is fuel produced from whole trees that come from BC forests? How low carbon is that fuel?
Well, the science shows not only, of course, that burning biomass emits more CO2 at the smokestack, than even coal, but that the net impacts of that, the accumulation of carbon, as you keep adding to it each year while trees grow back extremely slowly, it's, you know, the science shows that this is a huge source of carbon, and it's not a climate change solution. So as I pointed out, that Natural Resources Canada model actually allows people to explore different configurations and see for themselves what the carbon debt is on burning different kinds of biomass. I think it's a really good teaching tool. I encourage people to check it out. And you know, basically the idea that this is a low carbon or zero carbon or carbon neutral source of energy is based on fraud. It really is just fraud, and it needs to stop. I mean, it's people have got to wake up to the reality. And I think the thing is that the public really gets this issue, but the ones who don't get it are policymakers.
And Michelle, we've talked about language before, and there's a few things I just want to clarify so that everybody understands. There's a phrase that you use, and I think the government uses it. It's called secondary use of the forest. So just exactly what does that mean, a secondary use of the forest?
Well, I think most people would interpret that to mean that it's the use of waste products or residuals. Those are industry terms from logging. So I think that that's probably what most people would understand that term to mean. A secondary use of the forest would be just using the waste products from logging. So things like a slash pile that Tegan talked about. And yeah, I noticed that a lot of the government materials use the word utilize instead of use, which just drives me nuts from like a grammatical standpoint. Like why say utilize when you can just say use? Yeah, so I think that's what most people take to mean secondary use.
And what about the word waste? So that's a term that industry and government uses, waste. So that means they're going around, they're removing what they call slash piles, and they're scraping up whatever gets left behind after a clear cut. Now, if we talk about how forests function, is there such a thing as waste?
No, there's no waste in nature. The waste that's created is created as a result of industrial logging. And when they talk about, quote, utilizing or using waste, what they're really talking about is just like finding a new use for all the waste they create. It's not about reducing the amount of waste, because they log a set amount and then they create that much waste. So it's not about like reducing waste. Like a lot of the language I see in the press releases, they're reducing waste. Well, they're not reducing waste, because if they want to reduce waste, they would log less. It's really just finding a new use for that stuff. So that's what's happening here. At least that's how they're selling the idea of producing biomass and biofuels, is that it's somehow efficient use of waste. But no, they have complete control over how much they harvest, and if they really wanted to reduce waste, there would be less harvesting.
Thanks for that. And Tegan, you mentioned the word biologs. They're just putting the word bio in front of everything these days.
That was so funny.
So the terms that industry and government are using, I'm not sure, maybe Tegan or Michelle can answer this one: biomass, biofuels, bioenergy, biologs. What is the difference between those, if any?
I'm sure I'll say something and then hand it over to Mary and Michelle, because Mary, I'm sure this also drives you nuts. But my understanding of the term is that it describes its use. It doesn't describe the actual like ecological value or size or anything of the log. If you say biolog, it feels to me like a greenwashing exercise. And if industry wants to contradict me, I'm happy to hear it. They can return my calls, but I don't think that they have anything to say. I've noticed this trend. I mean, this is also, if you talk about secondary use of the forests or logging, there was an open letter from folks in the Kootenays will know, the sawmill in Castlegar, the Mercer exec put out an open letter asking the province to classify more logs as pulp logs, just so that they would cost less and that they could turn more logs into toilet paper. This is a very similar issue, right? If you classify something as low value, you don't have to pay as much for it. It's worth less and the optics are better. So I think that that's a pretty standard industry mechanism, and it seems like this current provincial government and frankly, any other that I can think of, is more than happy to walk that line with them hand in hand.
What I'm looking forward to now, and I don't want to give them any ideas, is for them to come out with the terms bioharvesting, biofeller buncher, biochainsaw.
They like the word bio. They think it's working for them.
I think that's because, you know, most members of the public want to hear that something is supposedly ecological. So it's a pretty clever move because, you know, bioeconomy sounds great. Like, I would love a bioeconomy as long as that meant, you know, protecting nature and working off the places we've already impacted, and, you know, being truly sustainable, meaning, you know, not having a lasting impact on Mother Earth. Like, that's the kind of bioeconomy I want. But the one they're promoting is one that's just based on destroying nature. So it's perfect greenwash, really.
Ecolog soon.
Yeah. Mary, did you have anything to add to that piece of the conversation?
Well, I think terminology is important. And, you know, certainly when I've talked to communications people, then they've said, don't say biomass. It's not biomass, it's trees. They're burning trees. And, you know, even when they're burning so-called waste or, you know, sawdust and this kind of thing, it still has a carbon impact. The word that I really truly despise, have come to despise more than any other word, is sustainable. Sustainable is a word that is used all the time by the biomass industry, and it really has no meaning. It's a total, you know, Rorschach of whatever you want it to mean is what it means. But policymakers use it all the time. The EU uses it all the time. And really, it's just total greenwash. It covers up. It's basically the idea that you're logging less than you're growing. But, you know, we can look at the data that Canada itself is reporting to the UNFCCC, and the forest carbon sink is decreasing. That's not sustainable, even by their own standards. So, you know, and there's really nothing sustainable when we're in the middle of a climate crisis. The West is on fire. You know, it's a true climate breakdown to be accelerating the transfer of forest carbon into the atmosphere and then paying people billions of dollars, and it is billions with a B. It's the definition of insanity. It truly is.
I think what people will see now, I certainly have seen, is the context, the world context that BC forestry falls in. And people will talk, we hear about climate change, and then we all feel kind of hopeless and powerless, like global climate change, right? What can I do about it? And we've seen that there is a significant impact of on climate change of logging and forestry that's happening in British Columbia. It has a worldwide impact. And that's how we in British Columbia can have a positive impact on climate change, is we can make changes to the way we do forestry here. In every single community, we all need to speak up and join forces as well. So maybe we'll finish on a bit of a positive note, and we'll talk about some possibilities and solutions. Tegan, you offered some ways that people could take action in that last slide. Let's bring that up again. Is it easy for you to bring that up? And let's finish on that, and then a couple of suggestions, either from or both from Michelle and Mary, on what people can do. Like, what can we as individuals do to make change here? Right, so prevent new construction or expansion of wood pellet export facilities. So we as BC citizens can push that demand at the government. We can end public subsidies to the wood pellet export industry. We can push for and demand that the BC government protect remaining primary and old growth forests, and maybe use all that money that they're using to subsidize the wood pellet industry to create actual, real, true green jobs. Thank you, Ian. Michelle, what are some ideas that you have for what we can do and possibilities and solutions.
I would say don't be an individual. Form a group of people that are taking care of your local primary forests. Form a community group to keep watch on your local natural forests, and make sure you know what's happening with them, and make sure that these facilities do not get built in your community, and take care of your precious primary forests. I always think of, you know, all those animals that were on that slide I had, of all the wildlife we still have the privilege of having up here, which frankly is miraculous given the impact of industrial forestry on this landscape. We need to take back control of our local forests.
Excellent, thank you. Mary.
I really second the idea that forming a group is very empowering and a good thing to do. I'm really focused on removing incentives for bioenergy. This is the thing that's driving it, is just the gobs and gobs of money that are available. And unfortunately, it's the European Union and Japan and Korea and other places that are offering really, really lucrative subsidies to burn biomass. And I don't know what the subsidy structure is in Canada. I assume it's also pretty high. So we've got to end policies that treat burning wood as renewable carbon-free energy and get it to stop counting toward renewable energy targets, reallocate those subsidies to true zero emissions energy like wind and solar. And you know, no one's saying don't burn wood. Like, people are always going to burn wood. People are going to burn wood in their fireplaces. Many people rely on wood heating, you know, for their livelihood, and that's okay. I mean, it's not great, it's not ideal, but it's okay. But what we're saying is, don't encourage more wood burning by paying people to cut and burn wood and counting it toward renewable energy targets. And we're actually coordinating a campaign in the European Union on this right now. And we need people literally from all over the world to join in and lend their voices to this campaign. I'm not talking about money, I'm talking about your voice, literally signing petitions and writing letters and things like that. And especially from places like BC that are providing, that are feeding the European Union's appetite for wood. The European Union needs to hear from you. So please do get in touch with me. My email was on the last slide there, and I'm sure you, Jennifer, will make the emails available to people who want them. And you know, let's really, you know, send a clear, strong message to policymakers that burning wood should not be counted toward renewable energy targets.
Excellent, thanks, Mary. Yeah, we'll put those links and that information up on the screen. Thank you all so much. This has been incredibly informative, and although disheartening, we need this information, we need the truth so that we can become empowered and we can take appropriate action and influence our decision makers in the right direction. Thank you all so much, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thank you, Tegan. Thanks, Mary.